So, what if I told you that a piece of software that literally helped build the modern world shares its name with one of the most infamous groups of the 21st century? No, that's not a mistake. It's the story of the other ISIS. It really does sound like a bizarre trivia question, doesn't it? But it's totally true. A super important operating system from 1975, a critical piece of the puzzle that gave us the personal computer, has this, well, incredibly unfortunate name. And understanding how that happened means we've got to go way back. And there it is, ISIS, spelled ISIS, and it stood for the Intel System Implementation Supervisor. And this wasn't some obscure little side project. Oh no. This was a flagship tool built by Intel themselves to power the very chips that would, well, pretty much change everything. Okay, so with the name explained, let's get into the real story here. I mean, to really get why this OS was so incredibly important, we need to transport ourselves back to the dawn of the microprocessor revolution. So let's dive right in. To really understand ISIS, you gotta understand the world it was born into. Picture it. It's 1975. Intel has just dropped this tiny piece of silicon called the 8080. It was the little brain that would go on to power the very first personal computers. I mean, this was a massive breakthrough. But a brain is kind of useless if you can't talk to it, and that was the huge problem they were facing. And that was the question every engineer was asking. You have this miracle chip, but how do you actually write code for it? How do you test it and figure out what's going wrong when it inevitably does? They were trying to build the future, but they were basically doing it blind. They needed a better tool, and fast. So, Intel's answer to this was the Microprocessor Development System, or MDS. The best way to think of it is like a dedicated workbench all in one box. A computer built for one single purpose, programming other computers. And the operating system that brought that whole workbench to life, you guessed it, that was ISIS. So the whole journey kicks off in 1975 with its creators, Ken Burgett and Jim Stein. Their original version pretty quickly evolved into its more famous successor, ISIS-2, which became the absolute gold standard for developers working with Intel's tech. For a while, it was the essential tool for building the future. But its story was far, far from over. We've talked about what it was and why it mattered, but what was it actually like to use? Okay, let's strip away all the graphics and mice we're used to and take a little tour of the raw command line world of a 1970s developer. Right. So forget everything you know about clicking on icons. Using ISIS meant you're staring at a blinking cursor on a screen and you typed everything by hand. If you've ever heard of an early OS called CP/M, which was basically the direct ancestor of MS-DOS, then you'd feel right at home. The whole vibe was almost identical. And just look at these commands. Copy, delete, dir to list your files. Does any of that sound familiar? It should. These aren't just little historical footnotes. This is the fundamental DNA of how we still interact with files today, a logic that was established right here and has stuck around for almost 50 years. But in other ways, it was a totally alien world. Can you imagine a file system with no folders? No, seriously. Each floppy disk was just one long flat list of all your files. And to access a floppy drive, you'd use these weird codes with colons, like F0:. It was a world of single directories and these huge 8-inch floppy disks. But here it is. Here's the number that really puts this whole era into perspective. The recommended amount of memory, of RAM, to run this entire operating system was 32 kilobytes. Not gigabytes, not even megabytes, kilobytes. A single photo on your phone today takes up hundreds of times more memory than the entire workspace of a pioneering 1970s developer. Just wow. Now, you might be thinking the story is a nice straight line from one version to the next, but the reality of early tech was, well, it was a lot messier. The ISIS family tree has some pretty strange and incompatible branches, which tells you a lot about just how chaotic the industry was back then. So the key thing to get here is that this was not a smooth evolution like we're used to with Windows or macOS today. ISIS-2 was the main one, sure. But later systems like ISIS PDS and ISIS IV were completely incompatible with each other. It was a total Wild West of competing standards, even inside the same company, which just shows you how fast the hardware was changing underneath it all. And this brings us to the final, and maybe the most important part of the story. How does a piece of foundational but pretty obscure software even manage to survive into the 21st century? So, after its time in the spotlight, ISIS and all the hardware it ran on, it just became obsolete. E-waste. Its code was destined to be lost on decaying floppy disks. So, why are we even able to talk about it with this much detail today? How did it survive? Well, the answer comes down to groups like the archive team. Now, they're not some big corporation or a government agency. They're a passionate volunteer group of, you could call them digital detectives or digital librarians, dedicated to hunting down our digital heritage before it just vanishes forever. And you gotta love their own description of what they do. They call themselves a rogue archivist collective dedicated to saving copies of rapidly dying or deleted websites. They are literally on the front lines of digital decay, trying to save history in an age where it can be erased with a single click. So, because of their hard work, websites full of information, software, and manuals for this old system are preserved. They capture a snapshot of it all, saving it from a server failure or an expired domain name. And thanks to them, the story of the Intel System Implementation Supervisor, it gets to live on. And this really leaves us with one final big thought. The story of ISIS is just one example that got saved. But every single day, crucial parts of our digital history, early websites, old software, entire online communities, they just vanish. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of the story of our own time is being written on a hard drive that will one day fail, and who's going to be there to save it?